The shift had been quiet for 6 hours when the freighter hit the beacon. Ma and Koss heard it before she saw it. A low, oscillating ping that cut through the hiss of the fry vats and the dull thrum of the orbital stabilizers, keeping Waypoint 11's lower ring from drifting. She had been standing at the pass-through window, elbows on the counter, watching the slow rotation of cargo pods against the dark. The grease smell had stopped bothering her 14 months ago. So had the long silences. There was something almost meditative about taking orders from dock workers and fuel techs and the occasional stunned tourist who couldn't believe there was a burger joint on a Waypoint station, about wrapping things in foil and sliding them through a slot, about watching headlights arc away through the plexiform window and vanish into the black. She set down the scraper and pulled the ping up on her wrist terminal. Distress signal. Standard civilian band. The source was just outside the station's traffic corridor, not far enough out to be lost, not close enough to have already been picked up by dock control. The kind of signal that lived in the gap between someone's problem and someone else's responsibility. She leaned back through the kitchen pass-through. "Hey, Dorvus, you reading a beacon on Channel 7? Cook, a four-armed Thelian who had been washing the same tray for 3 minutes, shook one of his secondary heads. "Not my job, Koss." "Not mine either," she said, and went to put on her jacket. It was a salvage hauler registry out of the Carina shelf, one of the old workhorse models that always looked like they'd been assembled from parts that didn't quite belong together. It was venting something slow and blue from its port coupling, which was never a good sign. Marin came in alongside it in her service tender, craft barely larger than an escape pod, and matched its drift. "Hauler on beacon," she said over open channel. "What's your situation?" A long pause. Then a voice, male, exhausted, young enough to still be surprised by bad luck. "Drive coils shot. Life support is nominal, but I'm going nowhere. You from the Waypoint, more or less." She was already craning to look at the coupling. It wasn't just the coil. The entire aft housing had been scored, and not by wear. The burns had a specific geometry, a radiating bloom pattern she had seen in training, and then in one actual encounter and had hoped never to see again. "How long have you been sitting out here?" 5 hours. Sent the beacon out when I realized nobody from dock control was picking it up. Another pause. "You see the hull?" "Yeah. I didn't do that. I mean, I know what it looks like. But I want to say, before you go anywhere, didn't do that. I had a passenger, paid cash, full rate, wanted passage to the Dravesi outpost. I didn't ask questions, because the money was good and I needed the money." His voice was starting to crack at the edges. "She wasn't human." Marin said nothing for a moment. Outside her window, the cargo pods turned slow circles in the dark. "What happened to her?" "She jumped ship. About 3 hours ago. Left the burn pattern and she was gone. Like she'd had somewhere to be all along and the ride with me was incidental." A pause. "I think she was running from something. Something that was going to come through here looking for her." Marin closed her eyes. She was 41 years old. She had spent 9 years as a first response specialist with the Galactic Margin Authority, the civilian auxiliary organization that operated in the space between treaty zones and jurisdiction lines, the place where the larger powers didn't go because the politics were too expensive. The GMA handled distress calls and hostage negotiations and the occasional first contact that no one wanted to admit was happening. She had been good at it. She had also watched her entire unit get dissolved in a bureaucratic restructure that was, in reality, a quiet acknowledgement that the problem they had been hired to solve had grown too large for the budget allocated to it. They had been given severance. She had drifted out here to Waypoint 11, to the Fry window, to the meditative clarity of work that did not cost anyone anything. "Get to an escape pod," she said. "Now, leave the hauler." "What? Why?" "My cargo is in. I'm not asking. Go." She heard him moving, heard the hatch seals engaging, heard the clunk of a pod separating from the hull. Then she turned her tender and went back toward the waypoint. She had 6 things in her quarters that she had not unpacked in 14 months. One was a personal effects bag. One was a photograph. One was a medical kit. One was a handheld signal jammer of the kind that the GMA no longer officially issued. One was a communications relay booster, also no longer official. One was a jacket with the old GMA shoulder patch on it, the patch she had not been able to bring herself to cut off. She put the jacket on and went to find Dorvus. He was still washing the tray. He looked at her and set it down. "You're going to need to close up early," she said. He looked at the jacket. He had never asked about the patch. He was a Thelian, and Thelians understood in a deep and philosophical way that certain conversations were none of their business. "How much time?" "I don't know. Maybe none. Maybe enough to get everyone to the lower ring." She was already moving toward the docking corridor. "Beacon from the hauler. It's going to draw attention. Wrong kind. Koss." He set down the tray. All four of his hands were still. "What is it?" She thought about the burn pattern on the hull, the radiating bloom, like a flower made of fire, that a Veth scout vessel left when it used its scatter drive to disengage from a dock clamp. The Veth were not technically war with anyone in this sector. They were also not technically not at war with anyone. They operated in that same gap between jurisdiction lines that the GMA had once occupied. Except where the GMA had operated with restraint, the Veth operated with a precision that they found indistinguishable from mercy. They took what they wanted. They did not usually destroy what they did not need. But the what they wanted had, in the last 18 months, shifted significantly toward human installations, human cargo, human personnel. Specifically, category of personnel who had once worked for organizations like the GMA. No one knew why. No one who had investigated it at close range had reported back. "Lock the emergency doors," she said. "The ones rated for vacuum. Eat whatever you want from the freezer. Don't answer any hails that don't use the station's internal code." "You didn't answer my question." She stopped in the doorway. She was quiet for a moment. "The worst thing I've ever dealt with," she said. "Professionally speaking. Lock the doors. Dorvus." She left. The booster went up on the outer hull in about 8 minutes, clamped to the sensor array housing, where it would be invisible from any approach angle. It would give her a 30-second advantage over any scan that the Veth were likely to run. 30 seconds in which she would know what was coming before it arrived. She clipped herself back to the airlock and pulled herself inside and sealed up and stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the station breathe around her. The trouble with the Veth was not their technology. Humans had spent 60 years telling themselves that the great equalizer of alien contact would be technology, that whoever had better tools won. The Veth had better tools, yes. Their propulsion systems were 2 centuries ahead of anything currently in human service. Their scanning arrays could read a human nervous system at a range of 2 kilometers, could distinguish fear from anger, from resignation, could identify specific individuals by the electromagnetic signature of their heartbeat. Their armaments were elegant. It was almost worse than if they'd been brutal. But the trouble with the Veth was not their technology. The trouble was their certainty. They were not cruel. Cruelty required imagining the experience of the other. The Veth had simply never learned to imagine that anything outside their own species constituted an experience worth modeling. They had encountered 43 other species in their history of expansion. Of those 43, 11 had survived to coexist. The other 32 were entries in a database. The Veth did not consider this a troubling ratio. It was, to them, simply how things went. A law of physics. You could not be angry at gravity. Marin had spent 5 years studying them before the GMA dissolved. She had read every debriefing, every contact report, every autopsy summary in the archive. She had come to understand, in the abstract, the thing that none of the theoretical contact specialists had ever managed to articulate in terms the policy people could use. That there was no negotiating framework that the Veth would recognize as legitimate, because legitimacy was, in their understanding, a property of the entity with the most comprehensive model of reality. They didn't negotiate, they assessed. If your civilization showed sufficient complexity in its model of the universe, they reclassified you upward and revised their approach. If you didn't, You were a resource. The 30 seconds from the booster arrived as a soft pulse on her terminal. She felt, very clearly, the old thing settling back into place inside her. The thing she had packed away with the jacket and the jammer, the thing that had kept her alive in 9 years of work in the gap between treaty zones. It was not bravado, it was not even confidence. It was simply the recognition that she was the person in the building who had thought about this problem the longest, and that therefore whatever happened next was, in a functional sense, her responsibility. She went to the operations console at the end of the docking corridor and pulled up the station's external sensor feed, and there it was. One scout vessel. Veth design, the compressed delta shape they used for insertions into active traffic areas, small enough to dock at a civilian waypoint without triggering the automated defense protocols. It was moving slowly, which meant it was scanning. 30 seconds at its current approach before it would be within hailing range. She opened the station's general broadcast channel. Attention! Arriving vessel. This is Waypoint 11 operational staff. You are approaching a civilian installation. Please identify and state your intention. Silence. Then, not over the broadcast channel, but directly into her wrist terminal, targeted tight beam that should have been impossible for a vessel this far out. A voice. Not quite a voice. A signal that resolved into voice in the way that a mathematical proof resolves into a conclusion. The sound of something that had thought about language and felt serviceable. You are Maren Koss, it said, GMA Specialist, Grade 6, inactive. Biometric profile is on file. She kept her own voice flat. I'm a fast food employee. You modified your station's sensor array 11 minutes ago. The booster you placed is a GMA standard relay model. Discontinued in. I found it in a storage locker. Was there something I could help you with today, or are you just passing through? A pause. The Veth paused, she knew, not because they needed time to think, but because they were recalculating. She was giving them unexpected input, and they were updating their model. This was the window. She was already moving. Trick. The thing she had learned in 9 years and 300 contact hours, and that the theoretical specialists had never understood because they had never been in the room, was that the Veth's certainty about the inferiority of other species was also the thing that made them most vulnerable to those species' behavior. They had an excellent model of themselves. Their model of others was built on data that was, in a critical way, incomplete. It did not account for what it felt like to be desperate, to have something worth losing, to make decisions under conditions that were not optimal, because conditions were never optimal and you learn to work in the rain. She hit the emergency override on the docking ring's magnetic clamps. The Veth vessel, which had been decelerating toward the station's outer dock, felt its approach vector suddenly change. Not because anything had pushed it, but because the dock it was planning to use had closed. And the alternatives required a course correction, and that course correction would take 14 seconds to compute because the station's outer ring had just started a rotation that was not on any civilian navigation chart, because it was a rotation that Maren had programmed into the ring's manual override 3 months ago during a safety drill that she had conducted entirely by herself, having filed the paperwork correctly and been ignored. 14 seconds. She used them. The jammer was a blunt instrument. It didn't block Veth communications so much as fill the relevant spectrum with noise until the signal-to-noise ratio became unworkable. She had 20 seconds of charge on it. She pointed it at the docking ring's external comm array and ran. The waypoint was not large. It had 17 active berths, a fuel depot, the Restros S, a medical station that was closed on Tuesdays, and a series of maintenance corridors that ran through the station's interior like a circulatory system. She knew every one of them. She knew which ones had working lights and which ones required a head-mounted lamp. She knew which bulkheads had been patched and which ones still had structural play in them, the kind of play that made them sound, in certain conditions, like a door opening when they were just settling. She reached the service bay at the station's core in 90 seconds. Bay was where the station's drone fleet lived. 12 service drones, automated, used for exterior maintenance and cargo transfer. They were not weapons. They had no weapons capability. They were slow-moving, round-shouldered, built for durability rather than agility. They ran on a simple task and return protocol that had not been updated since the station's original fit-out. She had been updating it, quietly, over 14 months, in the same way she had been doing everything quietly. The rotation program, the booster mount, the jammer charge. She had not planned for this specific situation. She had planned for some situation in the general way that someone who has spent 9 years in the gap between treaty zones understands that the gap has a way of following you. She pulled up the drone control panel. "All right," she said to no one in particular, the way she had a habit of talking to herself that the theoretical specialists would have found undisciplined. "Let's see what you know about service drones." She sent all 12 out. Not toward the Veth vessel, that would have been inefficient and wasteful. The drones went to the cargo pods, the dead hauler, the fuel lines, the communication buoys, the navigation beacons, full scatter of hardware that made a waypoint, and not just a point in space. They went to all of it, and they started doing their jobs, which was moving things carefully and with great patience from where they were to where they were not. From the outside, it would have looked like a busy station. The Veth vessel completed its course correction and attempted to re-establish contact. Found the comm array still noisy. Scanned the station's exterior and found 12 moving objects, none of them weapons, all of them clearly civilian maintenance hardware operating within their designated zones. The station's electromagnetic profile was complex, busy, alive with the ordinary noise of an installation that had a lot going on, their model updated. A busy station, actively maintained, staff who had responded to their approach quickly and with technical fluency. Not the empty waypoint they had been expecting to find. She knew this because their next transmission dropped the tight beam and went to standard hail. "Waypoint 11, the voice said. "We are experiencing navigation's difficulty. We request docking permission." She exhaled. She picked up the comm. "Waypoint 11 copies. I'm going to need you to hold your position for about 20 minutes. We've got some cargo transfer activity at the outer ring. Docking Bay 3 will be open after that. Please confirm you have sufficient fuel and life support to hold." Another pause. Recalculating. Confirmed. She let the 20 minutes be 20 minutes. She sat in the service bay and listened to the drones moving around outside, and she thought about the young man in the escape pod, who was probably very cold by now, and about the Thelian in the kitchen who was probably eating everything in the freezer, and about the woman who had ridden the hauler out here from wherever she'd come from, whoever she was, running from something, and had left a burn pattern on a hull and disappeared into the dark. She thought about what it took to run. She thought about what it took to stop running. She had been, if she was being honest with herself, not entirely sure which one she was doing. When the 20 minutes were up, she opened Bay 3, the Veth vessel docked, and then, before the dock seal had finished cycling, she sent the docking ring into the second rotation she had programmed, the one that did not open Bay 3, but instead cross-linked it to the fuel depot's emergency vent. The Veth vessel was not destroyed. She had not planned for that, because she did not plan for destruction. She planned for outcomes. The outcome she planned for was a Veth scout vessel fully occupied with a fuel contamination event on its docking collar, would keep its crew. 2. Standard configuration for a scout, busy for approximately 40 minutes while their vessel's automated systems to clear the contamination. 40 minutes was enough to get the hauler pilot out of his pod. Enough to get a distress signal out on a frequency that the GMA's successor organization, whatever it was calling itself these days, would recognize. Enough to set the station's automated systems to execute a drift pattern that would move Waypoint 11 2 kilometers from its current position before anyone was in a condition to notice. She found the hauler pilot floating in his pod about 600 meters off the station's port side. He was, As predict, very cold. He was also young, younger than she'd pictured from his voice, with a look on his face that she recognized as the specific expression of someone who has just discovered that the world has dimensions they were not previously aware of. He looked at her jacket as she helped him through the airlock. At the patch. "I thought the GMA was disbanded," he said. "It is. So what are you?" She sealed the airlock behind them and turned toward the service bay, where there was a lot still left to do. "Fast food employee," she said. "You want something to eat?" He stared at her for a moment. Then slowly, a look came over his face that was less like relief and more like the recalibration that happens when reality turns out to be more complicated than expected, which is its own kind of relief. "Yeah," he said. "Actually, yeah, I do." She led him back through the maintenance corridor with the head-mounted lamp because the lights in that section had never worked. Stepping over the patch in the bulkhead that sounded like a door when the station settled, and she thought about the woman on the hauler. Whoever she was, wherever she had gone, and she thought that there was probably a story there, a longer one, and that it would probably find its way back here eventually, because things in the gap between treaty zones had a way of cycling back. She thought, when it does, I'll handle it. The thought did not make her afraid. It made her feel, for the first time in 14 months, like herself. Dorvus had, in fact, eaten most of the freezer. He had also, with the quiet competence of someone who understood that certain practical things needed doing regardless of the circumstances, prepared a full-service setup for two, with the fryer going and the lights on and the pass-through window open, because a waypoint restaurant that looked operational from the outside was, in the current situation, a useful thing to be. "Going to want to file an incident report," Maren said, settling onto a stool. "With who?" She looked out the plexiform window at the cargo pods turning slow in the dark, at the distant lights of the Veth vessel still occupied with its docking collar, at the 2 kilometers of empty space that now separated the station from where it had been. "That," she said, "is an excellent question. The hauler pilot." His name turned out to be Cyril, which was not a name she would have guessed, ate 2 orders of whatever was quickest and stared out the window with the slightly glassy expression of someone who has recently been very cold in a small metal box. After a while, he asked her how she had known. Known what? That they'd wait, the 20 minutes, that they'd hold. She thought about it. It was hard to explain in terms that didn't require a significant amount of background reading. What she settled on was, they needed the information gap to resolve before they could act. They're very thorough. Thoroughness takes time. And the fuel thing. They hate a contamination event. Their vessels are clean by design. The idea of contaminants in the dock collar would have triggered every protocol they have, gave them something to focus on. Cyril absorbed this. "You knew all that. I read a lot." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The woman who hired me. You think you'll find her? I think she'll find me." Maren picked up her coffee, which Dorvus had made without being asked, because Dorvus understood that certain things were necessary. Whatever she was running from, I slowed it down. She'll hear about that. And when she does... Maren set the coffee down. She looked at the old GMA patch on her shoulder, which had gotten a small fuel smear on it somewhere in the last 2 hours. She thought about the 32 entries in the Veth database. She thought about 30 years of contact reports that all said the same thing in different ways. That the Veth's model of reality was comprehensive and precise and wrong because it had been built in the absence of a specific kind of data, the kind that only came from being the thing being modelled, from having something to lose and choosing to act anyway from a position that was not optimal and would never be optimal, and you learned eventually to work in the rain. "Then we'll see," she said, "what the next problem is." Outside the window, the cargo pods turned. The stars moved. The Veth vessel's lights pulsed slowly as its automated systems worked through their contamination protocols, patient and thorough and completely, precisely wrong about what had just happened to them. Cyril ordered a third thing. Dorvus made it without comment. The fryer hissed. The orbital stabilizers hummed. Point 11 drifted 2 kilometers off its registered position in the dark, manned by a 4-armed cook, a shivering hauler pilot, and a woman in a jacket with an old patch on the shoulder, and it was, in every way that the Veth could measure, unremarkable. That was the point. That had always been the point.